Welcome to Philosophy 3400 Ethics. Today we're looking at the opening sections of Theodor Adorno's Minima Moralia. We're going to start with the very first aphorism. I'm not exactly sure what to call these little short pieces, but the very first part for Marcel Proust. What is he getting at here? Well, Marcel Proust, of course, famous French writer, spent a lot of time in bed writing like he's sick, right? That's why he's in bed. And writing incredibly long, multi-part novel, Remembrance of Things Past, is how it's often translated into English. A long enterprise. He spent a lot of time using his imagination, Proust did, remembering events from his earlier life when he was a little bit healthier. And his life was devoted to writing a massive novel that is regarded as one of the pinnacles of 20th century literature. And that kind of a life of being a writer who spends a lot of time simply writing a novel that maybe isn't even fully published until after the author's death, is, for Adorno, along with, sort of theoretical life in general, represents something like is a kind of, traditional way of thinking about how to live an ethical life. Going all the way back to Aristotle, we find Aristotle claiming that the contemplative life is the best way of life for human beings trying to realize our potential as rational beings, and the best way really to live a fulfilling life, Aristotle claims, is the life of contemplation, where you simply try to understand why things are the way they are, things in general, the entire universe, everything in that universe, even imaginary things. And so the contemplative way of life has long been a candidate for living a fulfilling life, living an ethical life, understanding why the world is the way it is, why we are the way we are. And I think, the general thesis of Adorno's Minima Moralia is that living an ethical life may very well be nearly impossible in the 20th century, and that, in a sense, the best we can hope for is something like a Minima Moralia, a sort of humble ethics, humble morals, which is perhaps best summarized in the motto following the Holocaust: never again, right? What comes out of something like the Holocaust in Germany in the 20th century is the idea that we can never let that happen again, and therefore our ethics then should aim to at least prevent the very worst atrocities from being repeated. Not a very ambitious ethical program, but I think from Adorno's perspective, given all of the brutality and the barbarism, as he might put it, and the atrocities that have characterized the 20th century and the 21st century, the mass, slaughter of human beings on the flimsiest of pretexts, Adorno would view traditional ethical approaches as hopelessly obsolete at this point. The best we can do right now is avoid repeating the very worst. Okay, so let's get into section 1 then. Okay, so in section 1, for Marcel Proust, I'm not going to read the whole thing. Let us, though, have a look. Okay, so I think, the basic substance of what he's getting at here is, for those pursuing, say, the life of an artist or an intellectual, on the one hand, there's a kind of generalized anti-intellectualism that would, you know, would view this kind of a life as idleness, as suspicious, if it cannot be reduced to sort of practical outcomes. The occupation, as Adorno puts about 8 lines down, the occupation with things of the mind has not, by now, itself become practical. And so the idea here is there's a kind of popular anti-intellectualism that demands of any intellectual or artist that they sort of produce something that can be understood in practical terms, that can be reduced to, say, its popularity in terms of the number of sales, or the number of positive reviews in the press, and etc., number of likes and whatnot. And so there's a kind of degradation of artistic and intellectual pursuits that reduces them to either something very suspicious and worthless and pretentious, but generally a view held by those who themselves struggle to understand the artwork or intellectual product in question. But then, as if that's not bad enough, as if you don't have a sort of public that is no longer educated enough to be able to appreciate serious art or serious intellectual pursuits, right? Not because of some natural stupidity, right, but because our educational systems aim to produce a docile workforce rather than an educated public. So on the one hand, there's that problem. On the other hand, as he puts it, even if an artist or intellectual does find some place to, say, earn a living in some sense, a paycheck that is in some sense reliable, right? What happens then, he says, is that how to put this here? There we go. I'd say about 10 lines up from the bottom here of page 21. The departmentalization of mind is a means of abolishing mind under contract. So this is the other thing that happens in universities and think tanks, anywhere you find intellectuals actually working and, being paid for the work, unlike Proust, right? They're not independently wealthy, independent scholars doing what they want to do with their time. Instead, they become parts of organizations, and what happens then, he says, is the departmentalization of mind. In other words, a sort of academic division of labor, increasing specialization, and the one thing that comes out of that then is a number of very specialized scholars who no longer have any sort of any understanding of how an intellectual class has a general project, let's say, that goes beyond simply publishing peer-reviewed papers and books in your field. Public intellectuals disappear largely, and intellectuals like Adorno, who are proficient across disciplines. This now is much less common, to put it mildly. An intellectual like Adorno is largely no longer possible in the academia or outside of it, because of what Adorno is drawing attention to here, the departmentalization of mind. It performs this task all the more reliably since anyone who repudiates the division of labor simply by taking pleasure in their work makes himself vulnerable by its standards in ways inseparable from elements of his superiority. One thing he's getting at, I think, here is that, actually enjoying intellectual work and pursuing it simply for its own sake and for the pleasure it brings is replaced and superseded by a system where people are essentially have their work quantitatively assessed, and are held to certain quantitative metrics instead of simply being able to pursue ideas wherever they lead, free from imperatives to publish and whatnot. Order is ensured, Adorno claims. Some have to play the game because they cannot otherwise live. You're looking at one of those folks right now. And those who could live otherwise are kept out because they do not want to play the game. There are a lot of people who would be talented scholars who are not working in the academy today because they were disillusioned by the game playing that happens in intellectual circles, including at universities. So they are literally alienated and they walk away or they give up for these reasons. It is as if, Adorno writes, the class from which independent intellectuals have defected and this class is the bourgeois class, largely, that his intellectuals generally come almost invariably from the middle or upper classes. And Adorno's pointing out, they think, in a sense, that by engaging in artistic or intellectual work, they get out of this business world and the imperatives of profit. However, a sort of revenge happens here, and this economic system makes itself felt within institutions that previously seemed to exist outside of its scope and range. Universities used to be devoted to the pursuit of knowledge for knowledge's own sake and to improve the lives of everyone around. And now they are essentially finishing schools and mere job preparation. And what intellectual pursuit still exists is subject to a lot of these very restrictions and constrictions Adorno's pointing out in this opening section. Let's move to section 2 now, grassy seat. Today, Adorno writes about 4 lines down, we are faced with a generation purporting to be young, yet in all its reactions, insufferably more grown up than its parents ever were. I mean, this is an interesting thesis. I'm not that interested ultimately, though, in these kinds of generational characterizations. I mean, nonetheless, I think what Adorno's getting at, though, he's not sort of, this is not a moral condemnation here, but what's really going on is the economy's changing. And what's changed, and this shouldn't be news to us today, right? But what's changed economically is that households that used to do fairly well with one income earner, generally the male, right? That's no longer, that's even in the 1940s changing. And the reality is becoming that that the single breadwinner in a family is largely going away. This requires, say, both parents to work now. That diminishes the authority of the traditional male head of household, but it also is a testament to this profound economic change that's essentially leading to the poor and the working class and people having to work more just to get by. And the reality here is, again, and even the middle class, right, move from single, from homes in which there was a single person able to earn for the whole family, to a situation where both partners must work, where even children sometimes have to work. And what this leads to then is young people becoming more concerned with career development and earning money than even their parents were. So there's one thing he's getting at is there's kind of less idealism, there's less sort of pursuing knowledge and art for its own sake. There's a much more concern with this economic insecurity. And now that my parents' earning potential has declined or something, or people have to work harder and more for less, this then leads younger people to have more economic anxiety and to sort of grow up and start thinking about their finances sooner and sooner. And I think that's one thing he's drawing attention to here. So, I think what he's getting at here, let's not read it too personally. And I don't want to also, attribute to Adorno this kind of almost generational stupidity where every generation kind of condemns the younger kids today, right? There is an element, there's a superficial element of that here, but what he's really getting at is, is that in places like the United States and Germany in the 30s and 40s, households that had previously been able to subsist with a single income earner and that had a kind of family sphere of privacy and leisure that was made possible on that basis are being replaced by families in which both parents have to work, in which even children may have to be concerned with earning a living. as well, or helping their families financially. And then this leads to this, he thinks, sort of change in youth culture where the young are more worried about landing a job and earning money than they are about having a sort of period in their life where they can freely develop and pursue interests. And he thinks there's a space for criticism and transformation of your society in those kinds of situations that now gets replaced by careerism and the rat race. Even the outdated, inconsistent, self-doubting ideas of the older generation are more open to dialogue than the slick stupidity of Junior. Okay, unpolitical attempts, he writes, to break out of the bourgeois family usually lead only to deeper entanglement in it. Sometimes it seems as if the fatal germ cell of society, the family, were at the same time the nurturing germ cell of uncompromising pursuit of another. Okay? With the family, there passes away, while the system lasts, not only the most effective agency of the bourgeoisie, but also the resistance which, though repressing the individual, also strengthened, perhaps even produced him. What he's getting at here is this private sphere that he thinks existed in middle-class families. A space for a family life separate from your social and political and economic life. A sort of private space where personality could be formed in interesting and new and exciting ways is vanishing, and people are basically being forced to think of themselves entirely as workers, producers, earners, precisely to the extent that the economic standard of living is declining for most people in these economies. In other words, just as the middle class is vanishing, you find people desperately attempting to sort of preserve something of this private sphere, and yet it's never been less real, he thinks, than in his time, and especially it's gone even further. Now there hardly is any privacy left in the world any longer. Fish in water. Let's move on to 3. Adorno's not easy to understand. That's because he's an immensely learned person who doesn't, right, as the introduction here says, there are no footnotes here. This presupposes a sort of high level of education, knowledge of history, literature, psychology, and whatnot is all presupposed in this work. And if you feel yourself, that you're not getting everything that he's saying here, that's typical. That's typical. That was certainly the case for me when I first read Adorno as well. I felt like I understood maybe a third to a half of what he was writing, and what I understood I found fascinating. A lot of other things simply went over my head. But the onus is on us as readers, right, to raise ourselves to the level of what we're confronting, not to fault what we're confronting for not being where we're at. And that's just reality when it comes to the history of philosophy and art and any other endeavor that has been taking place for thousands of years. We need to make ourselves capable of understanding it. It's not the job of these traditions to come down to our level and speak to us in our language. That's for sure, right? Something is going on here in the history of philosophy, literature, art, music, whatnot. We can either educate ourselves to become aware of that, or we can basically not really understand any of it, and it can just transpire over our heads. And then what happens is usually people have filtered down to them diluted, vulgarized, simplified versions of what's up there in the cultural sphere at a higher level, and they end up sort of, imbibing some of this culture despite themselves, but often without really understanding where it's coming from and what it ultimately amounts to. So, if you're frustrated having a look at Adorno, you wonder what the heck is he talking about, there's also the issue that he's not easy to translate into English. And again, right, the onus is on any reader interested in understanding what's happening in culture over time, right? If there's not a good translation into the language you're familiar with of some important work, The onus is on you then to figure out what the translation means or to be able to read the language, etc. in its original. Otherwise, you get left out, right? So if you're feeling like some of this is passing, what happened with me earlier, many years ago, is the way I would feel about reading something like this is I was fascinated by the parts I understood. I was frustrated by what I didn't understand, and it motivated me to remedy what I didn't understand. That's probably the best approach you can take, right? If you don't get something here, look it up and figure it out. Or ask for help. That's what you do. Or you let it go, maybe, for now, and you come back to it later. Something. Okay, but it is a challenge. That's for sure. It is a challenge to understand a text like this. It's been very challenging in English, for sure. Fish and water. The entire private domain, Adorno writes on page 23, about 5 lines from the top, the entire private domain is being engulfed by a mysterious activity that bears all the features of commercial life without there being actually any business to transact. Okay? Well, sadly, there's a lot of business to transact now. This mysterious activity, this commercialized activity invading the private sphere. Again, there is no privacy, right? You're lying in bed with your smartphone being bombarded by political propaganda and advertising. Welcome to the 2021, right? All these nervous people, Adorno writes, from the unemployed to the public figure, liable at any moment to incur the wrath of those whose investment he represents. Right? Are politicians, actually free, or are they compelled to sort of do what they do because of the money that backs them? All these nervous people believe that only by empathy and by being assiduous, that is, really working hard and being responsible, serviceability, being flexible, arts and dodges, being resilient, by tradesmen's qualities needed to run a nice little small business, can they ingratiate themselves with the executive, the CEO, the Elon Musk and whatnot, the Mark Cubans of the world? Can they ingratiate themselves with the executive they imagine omnipresent? And soon there is no relationship that is not seen as a connection. All relationships become transactions, is what he's getting at in this political economic situation we find ourselves in. Even things like forming a relationship with another person, a friend, an acquaintance. Merely a business transaction, a quid pro quo. No impulse, not first censored as to whether it deviates from the acceptable. I mean, think about politics today, right? Riven through with all these polls, right? Everything articulated by some politician then is tested to see how it's received, right? Branding, too, and marketing work this way. Focus groups and whatnot. Okay, and so the market, the principle of exchange, right? It's supposed to be a free market here, and I think what Adorno's getting at is, and yet it seems to result in people being coerced. Now, let's go down. I mean, we don't have to follow this through. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details here, but if you look about 6 lines up from the bottom of page 23, earlier, Adorno writes, and there's a kind of nostalgia here. Adorno's looking back to an earlier time, around the turn of the last century, when things were still different, he thinks. Earlier, when something like the maligned bourgeois division between professional and private life still existed, a division whose passing one almost now regrets, anyone who pursued practical aims in the private sphere was eyed mistrustfully as an uncouth interloper. There used to be a kind of dignity to this private sphere outside of work. It was uncouth to engage in business transactions in this kind of sphere. And yet that is different now. Now there seems like there is no place where you shouldn't be thinking about business concerns, right? In other words, there's no longer anywhere where transactions are inappropriate, so it seems. Today it is seen as arrogant, alien, and improper to engage in private activity without any evident ulterior motive, right? And so even if you're doing something as simple as playing soccer on the weekend. The idea is you're a fool if you're just playing soccer because you like the game and you're just trying to enjoy yourself when you're not at work. What a fool, right? You got to use something like this soccer league as a networking opportunity. Get to know the umpires and the refs or whatever. Um, you know, make some connections that could be lucrative for you and for other people, right? Like, what a lost opportunity if you just join a soccer league or a softball league and just enjoy playing the game to relax and refresh yourself when you're not at work, and just have, human relationships with people instead, right? This is just one more sphere in which you can acquire some sort of social power, where you can also do things that could pay off for you in your job, right? And other people are doing the same thing. And if you're not doing that, you are viewed as arrogant, alien, and improper. Really, you're just here to play the game? The heck, we're here to get some business done. And this even, infects institutions such as churches, right, which turn into sort of social clubs, where people are still, essentially forming relationships with ulterior motives rather than doing what they are ostensibly there to do. Not to be after something, right? Not to be pursuing something, not to be making money, for example, is almost suspect. No help to others in the rat race is acknowledged unless legitimized by counterclaims. Countless people are making, from the aftermath of the liquidation of professions, this is, of course, he's writing this in the aftermath of the Great Depression. Countless people are making, from the aftermath of the liquidation of professions, their profession. In other words, this economic, insecurity and terror, frankly, that took over the world during the Great Depression, that leads to hyper professionalization as a kind of outcome. And he thinks this is ludicrous because what something like the Great Depression shows, or even this current crisis we're in, is precisely how what's the word I'm looking for here? How disposable most workers are from this economic system's vantage point. That is, entire industries can go up in flames overnight and be essentially destroyed, and millions of people can lose work, and despite the skill they may have, despite their professionalism. That's the reality, right? Is that we're all at the mercy of what we're calling the market. And yet people seem to think they can do things at a personal level to make sure that they're going to be safe and secure. And the Great Depression and other serious economic collapses and crises have shown us how vulnerable we are. All right, one more section I want to look at. How nice of you, Doctor. We're going to skip 4 for now and move into this 5th section. There is nothing innocuous left. The little pleasures, expressions of life that seemed exempt from the responsibility of thought, not only have an element of defiant silliness, of callous refusal to see, but directly serve their diametrical opposite. Even the blossoming tree lies, the moment its bloom is seen, without the shadow of terror. Even the innocent, how lovely, becomes an excuse for an existence outrageously unlovely. I think we have to remember, while he's writing this, Jews are being murdered by the millions. That's what's happening. He knows it's happening, and yet people are going about their lives in Southern California, where he has, fled to at this point, and parts of the United States. And you have to continue living, right? And people, for instance, will have dinner parties, and there may be musical concerts at times and whatnot. People still take walks in the park on Sunday or something like this, and I think that's what's in the background. And so if that's hard for you to sort of wrap your head around because you think or you believe that we're no longer living in a world characterized by mass atrocities that are ongoing, right? I'd encourage you to think that we have more in common with Adorno's time than we might believe, and as in his time. Many people in the United States and even people around the world were not that aware of what was going on until afterwards. That's also true today. And so, if you think there aren't, people being systematically imprisoned, tormented, and even killed, it's probably because we're not looking hard enough. And so, once you start to understand that these things are happening, maybe even in your name, maybe even with your tax dollars, for example, maybe even with your vote of support, whether or not you know, that's where this kind of thought comes in, right? How is this possible? This kind of systematic brutality. Okay, mistrust is called for in the face of all spontaneity, impetuosity, all letting oneself go, which all appears as just frivolous distraction from the brutality and the reality of the violence and the oppression and the destruction that is taking place. The chance conversation in the train, when to avoid dispute, one consents to a few statements that one knows ultimately to implicate murder. Such conversations happen every day, even today, right? Lock them up and throw away the key. When so-and-so goes to jail, they're going to, right, be brutalized in jail and they deserve it, etc. Or, the way that people will casually talk about murdering large numbers of people, often on the basis of misinformation or disinformation. It was already happening in Adorno's time. Obviously, he's undergoing the sort of Nazi rise to power, the Nazi seizure of the government, and the Holocaust. And of course, there were conversations he and others had in the events that led up to this, where basically the writing was on the wall ahead of time, if you had just known where to look, as it is today. As it is still today, right? Since, after all, here's a cliche that is true, right? Those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. Every visit to the cinema leaves me, we can't do this anymore, Adorno, visit the cinema, but every visit to the cinema leaves me against all my vigilance stupider and worse. And so one thing he's getting at here is even, it seemed like going to the movies and watching, Charlie Chaplin back in Adorno's day. And Chaplin is an exception here for Adorno, but nonetheless, what he's getting at here is, these movies, these shows we watch to find relief and to just kind of enjoy something simple and humorous actually make us stupid. We are being conditioned and miseducated, for lack of a better term, by the cultural products we turn to for simple recreation. Even things as simple as the commercials, right? You watch on television, are not innocuous, as he puts it at the beginning. Let's go to the very end of this section. For the intellectual, inviolable isolation is now the only way of showing some measure of solidarity. That's a paradox, right? How can I show solidarity with others by closing myself off? All collaboration, he writes, all the human worth of social mixing and participation merely masks a tacit acceptance of inhumanity. It is the sufferings of men that should be shared. The smallest step towards their pleasures is one towards the hardening of their pains. We shouldn't come together and play frivolous games with each other in a world characterized by mass brutality and atrocity. Instead, we need to come together when we socialize and share in a sense our suffering. That is, we should be motivated by sympathy and empathy to identify where suffering is occurring, where people are being brutalized, and we should go there and we should share in that suffering until it is overcome. We saw something like this, right, in the demonstrations that took place after the murder of George Floyd, right? You saw more than just, for instance, black people demonstrating. You saw people from a variety of backgrounds coming together, sharing the suffering of one community. Okay, I think we've said enough for today here on these sections from Adorno's Minima Moralia. Thank you for joining me.